Good morning and welcome. Thank you so much for joining the University of Washington Libraries and the University of Washington Press for this morning's program in the lovely Rancho Mirage Library. What a tremendous facility and resource you have here, and thank you to the libraries for hosting us. I'm Nicole Mitchell, Director of the University of Washington Press. The Press is the oldest and largest nonprofit publisher of scholarly and general interest books in the Pacific Northwest, and we are part of the University of Washington in Seattle. We report to and work closely with the University of Washington Libraries and have the shared goal of connecting people with knowledge. I'd like to recognize my colleagues from the UW Libraries who are here with us today. Cheryl Stiefel, I don't know if Cheryl is in the room. Cheryl in the room, she may be out at the table, who is Associate Dean and Director of Advancement for the UW Libraries, and Amanda Pirog, who helped organize today's program, the library's outreach officer. The Press's mission is to publish compelling and transformative work with regional, national, and global impact. We are committed to the idea of research and scholarship and good writing as a public good, and we work collaboratively with our authors to produce books that meet the highest editorial and production standards. As part of the University of Washington's outreach mission, we serve our local communities by publishing books that tell the stories of our region and by bringing those stories to the world. Our regional books showcase the distinctive history, natural history, and cultures of the Pacific Northwest. Which brings me to the work of today's speaker and our author, David B. Williams. It is truly my very great pleasure to introduce David Williams to you this morning. David is a geologist by training and the author of 7 books. His most recent publications, published by the University of Washington Press, include the award-winning Too High and Too Steep, Reshaping Seattle's Topography, which explores the unprecedented engineering projects that shaped Seattle during the early part of the 20th century. He is also the author of Seattle Walks, Discovering History and Nature in the City, which weaves together Seattle's human and natural history through a series of 17 self-guided urban walks. His latest book, which he co-authored with Jen Ott of History Link, is entitled Waterway. It was a finalist for the Washington State Book Award, and it explores the economic and environmental impact of the Seattle Locks and Ship Canal. David is a curatorial associate at the Burke Museum at the University of Washington and regularly leads guided walks that explore Seattle's architecture, geology, and history. An avid reader, biker, and hiker, David lives in Seattle with his wife, who is also a discerning editor of his work, Marjorie Kittle, who I believe is also here with us today. There's Marjorie at the back of the room. This morning, David is going to give you a preview of his next book, which is tentatively scheduled for publication in the fall of 2020. It explores the unique human and natural history of the Puget Sound area. In conducting the scientific research for his Puget Sound book, David tells me that he dropped his notebook in the water, has been pinched by a Dungeness crab, chased by herring bait balls, stood inches away from a fish with enough teeth to give him bad dreams at night, scooped up thousands of fish eggs in his hands, watched an eagle chasing an osprey holding a herring, has eaten 6 varieties of oysters in a single sitting, and has observed creatures from the very deepest part, 900 feet down, of Puget Sound. One of David's goals as a writer is to encourage people to slow down, observe the world around them, ask questions, and make deeper connections to nature and place. I hope that David's talk today will also inspire some of you to take a pause and make a deeper connection with your own environments. David will be here after his lecture to sign books, answer questions, and we'll have books for sale just outside this auditorium. So please join me in welcoming our author and my very good friend, David B. Williams.
Thank you. Good morning. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here. And let me see if I can get the technology going. And start with a little drink of water, if you don't mind. Before I begin, so how many of you are UW graduates? Wow. How many of you don't even know what the University of Washington is? All right. Well, it's the place that gets water. Well, I hear you've had a little bit of rain over the last few days, and the snow on the mountains. How lovely is that? So I really want to thank Cheryl and Amanda from the University of Washington for asking me to be here, and thank Nicole for that wonderful introduction. But more importantly, I want to thank both of them for their ongoing support of my work. I've been fortunate to give a couple of talks now for the library, and it's without their help, I would not really be able to do some of the things I've been able to do. And in particular, the libraries are this astounding resource. Whether I am deep down in the depths in the special collections, looking at individual papers that someone has given to the University of Washington, or taking advantage of the electronic systems that they have in terms of I'm doing research and all of a sudden I need some obscure paper, scientific article, and within seconds I can have that on my computer. So it is a gift for me and a privilege for me to be able to use those resources and then also to be able to give back to them through this talk. So as Nicole said, this comes from a book I'm working on about Puget Sound, weaving together human and natural history. 4 of the chapters focus primarily on people, and this will be an example of one of them, and 4 of them focus primarily on natural history, where I got pinched and lost things and saw weird fish. And I also was lucky enough to be out with a group of divers from the Suquamish tribe when they were diving down and collecting gooey duck at the bottom of Puget Sound. If you're not familiar with gooey duck, they're those clams in the big shell with the very, well, let's just cut to the chase. The very phallic-shaped appendage on them. So I've done some really fun things and interesting things. And for me, what's great is that I grew up in Seattle. I've now lived there for 20 years with my wife after being in southern Utah for about 9 years, is that I keep developing these deeper connections through learning the stories. And as Nicole said, that really is my goal as a writer, is to help people, I hope, or encourage you to go out and ask those questions and wander around and maybe take things that you've always looked at and gone, I never really thought about that. Why is that X or Y, or what is that? And so I'm hoping in today's talk that I will give you some things to think about Puget Sound. And let's see if I can make it work. Oh, I know I go that way. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with Puget Sound, this body of water here. And Seattle is right here. Here's Tacoma, Olympia, then obviously up into Victoria. And Puget Sound is one of these places that really doesn't have an official definition. Depends on who you talk to. Some people will push it up into the San Juan Islands. The official definition from the state goes up to the Canadian border and all the way out to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. But the area I'm focused on is south of Port Townsend that comes all the way down to Olympia. And this area was known by the native people of the region as Holge, meaning the salt water. And it wasn't really a way that we think of landscape in terms of a definition on a map. It was more of a concept, more of an idea in the sense that we are of the salt. This is where we have our livelihood. And in particular, it was a way to compare themselves to people who lived up the rivers or in the foothills. And there was actually one of the early ethnographers came across an insult. And I apologize for any of you who happen to be from this particular location that's about to be insulted. But it was people who had low breeding were like that person from Issaquah. Some of you understand that. I like it. You get that. You get what that means. So those of you who are from Issaquah, it's okay. I'm sure you all are really nice people. But it was this, again, it was really a way to connect a place that they really didn't define it specifically by the way we think of things geographically. They thought about it through relationships and connections to the landscape. But all of that really changes in May of 1792, when George Vancouver, the British explorer, arrives at Port Townsend in this northern end. So again, here's the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the supposed Strait of Juan de Fuca. Big debate about that, which if you buy the book when it comes out, you'll learn more. But he gets here and he sails down. He's in 2 large vessels, and he comes down to about Seattle. This is roughly the Seattle area. He didn't understand Bainbridge Island. But he's off what's known as Restoration Point on Bainbridge Island. And on mid-May of 1792, he sends his lieutenant, Peter Puget, south in 2 small boats to explore the waterway that continues down here to map this waterway. Puget's gone for about a week. He returns, and when he returns, Vancouver writes on May 29th, 1792 in his journal, in honor of his exertions, I name this Puget's Sound. And you can see, I can see on the map, very hard to see, it actually does say Puget's Sound. And originally, Puget Sound was just the area south of Seattle. So down Seattle, Tacoma, down to Olympia. That was the original Puget's Sound with apostrophe S. And that was a very typical naming formation, if you will. The way they sort of saw the world is that it was Puget's Sound. Just a few days earlier, they name a body of water Possession Sound because that was the day that the British took possession of Puget Sound, never minding the fact that people had been living there for the last 13,000 years and still live there, and were still obviously thriving cultures. But so the area north, from what we think of as Admiralty Inlet, modern-day Admiralty Inlet is really just between Port Townsend and Whidbey Island. But they had the entire body of water as Admiralty Inlet. But now, over time, Puget Sound, as we've clearly has grown over time, and it is this body of water. And that's really the place that I am interested in, is looking at the stories, the people of Puget Sound. Even though many of my stories will cross out of north of Admiralty Inlet, some go all the way up into Canada. And what makes Puget Sound sort of unique in many ways is that it's this body of water that is very navigable. We think of a place like being out on the coast, West Coast, out on the outer coast of Washington. Big waves, big storms. We don't get that in Puget Sound. We don't have this. It's a very benign waterway. And if we look at it from a temperature point of view, it just doesn't get that hot in Puget Sound. As you know, if you've lived there, people start panicking at about 75 degrees and about 45, either direction. It snows, we paralyze. So it's a very benign place. There's no bugs. The biggest challenge, of course, would be the tides. That the average tidal range on a daily basis at the north end of the Sound is about 8 feet in change, and at the south end of the Sound, 15 or 18 feet. And as that, if you will, that breath of water from the Pacific Ocean comes into the Sound, it creates very challenging currents. So people are going to have to deal with that, and that will come up soon. And I just want to read an early description of Puget Sound from the territorial governor at the time, Isaac I. Stevens. So this is 1854-55. Nothing can exceed the beauty and safety of these waters for navigation. Not a shoal exists within them. Not a hidden rock, no sudden overfalls of the water or the air, no such strong flaws of the wind as in other narrow waters. So it really was an ideal place to move through and to navigate. We know that, as I said, people arrived in the Puget Lowland about 13,000 years ago. The oldest evidence comes from a site in Redmond. A bunch of rocks that have been collected there, hundreds of artifacts where people were working the rock to make stone tools. And we can sort of assume that they must have moved through the landscape by water because, and again, if you've been there, it's a very challenging landscape to get through with the dense forest, with the topography. So water would have been the natural way to move. And you can maybe make some sort of assumption that they were in a canoe, but we don't know. We have no archaeological evidence that dates back in terms of transport back more than a few hundred years. But what we do know is that the great forests that we think of today, the western red cedar, the Douglas fir, that ecosystem really did not take over the Puget Lowland until about 5,000 years ago. So about 10,000 years after the end of the last ice age, colder, drier, the environment slowly changes to about 5,000 years ago when we get western red cedars. And that was the key for building canoes. Probably not coincidentally at that time is when we start to see woodworking tools show up in the archaeological record. So you have the tools, you have the material, you have the need. Logic says that they must have probably started building canoes at that time. And this is one of my favorite paintings of this landscape, the Albert Bierstadt painting from the Rainier Club, Mount Rainier, and the classic canoe at the bottom. And one of the couple things about this one, Albert Bierstadt never saw Mount Rainier, never made it into Puget Sound, so great ideas. But I think also what's important is that he must have seen or talked to people. He had been up in Vancouver on Vancouver Island, so he had sort of had a feel for the landscape. But I think he clearly recognized, and there's another painting from this time period that has a very similar image of Rainier, water, and canoes, that these canoes were essential to understanding this place, essential to understanding the people who lived in this region, that was their connection. That was the way they moved through the landscape. We know that there were several varieties of canoe in those 5,000 years that they had been working with them. They had perfected different designs. The one that was in the image, the Bierstadt image, is known as, it's this upper one, this war or northern canoe. These are the big ocean-going canoes, the ones that could be 60, 70 feet long, maybe hold 2 or 3 dozen people. They were more used on the outer coast, up on Vancouver Island, but they certainly made it down into the Sound. But within the Sound, the dominant ones were the next two down, the freight canoe and the trolling canoe. These are known as the Coast Salish variety of canoes. These were the smaller canoes. These were the everyday canoes. These were the canoes that if you just decided, hey, I want to go across and go to this great hunting ground, hop in the canoe, go across. And people did this regularly. They didn't think anything of crossing from the west side to the east side, back and forth. And we know that the Suquamish tribe, which is mostly based up off of the Kingston area, that they came across very regularly because there was no large freshwater lake out on the peninsula. There was, and there still isn't, for that matter. And they would come across to take advantage of plants and animals in Lake Washington. And people didn't think anything, 10, 12 miles just to paddle across, just like we don't think anything generally of driving 10 or 12 miles. They didn't think anything of paddling. And then those Issaquah people, apparently despite what the people on the Salt thought, they actually were pretty wise, they had developed this shovel-nosed canoe. And this is the canoe that would have been used in the rivers, all the big rivers and all the small rivers. It was a vessel that you could stand in the front and paddle, and you could then spear fish or catch fish. So it was a very well-adapted boat, as were the freight and the trolling canoe. The one man and the children's canoe were just, again, sort of modifications on the theme. But people, again, were using these for thousands of years. When the first expeditions arrive in Puget Sound, they describe boats in an area where 400 men came up in canoes, single boats that held 30 people. And Charles Wilkes, who is an American explorer, arrives in Puget Sound in 1841, who was, I think, what we would generally call a racist to this day, would describe the canoes as they may be considered elegant. And they really were. It was just an amazing evolution of technology to create these really ideal ways to move through the waterway. But over time, as you might imagine, the connection with the canoes changes, particularly as the native people adapted to the changes in their environment, in particular the incoming of settlers who brought eventually motors, and I'll talk about that in a second. And the canoe culture really started to fade from Puget Sound until 1989 in the state centennial. And a group of tribal elders from around the western Washington decided to try and revive the canoe culture. And they worked with the state and with the federal government to go out and be able to cut down cedar trees and were able to make canoes. And they had what was known as the paddle to Seattle. There were about 25 canoes that came down the Sound, and then they met on the west side of the Sound and then paddled across to Seattle to Golden Gardens at the north end of the city. And out of that, you've now come this big revival. So this is the most recent, it's what's known as the Canoe Journey. And every year, there's a gathering of canoes at one of the tribes or one of the First Nations in the Salish Sea area, which is the Salish Sea. If you're not familiar with that idea, this is a term that's been developed over the last decade or two that encompasses both the American side and the Canadian side of the water, so the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the Strait of Georgia, recognizing that that boundary at the 49th parallel, no fish, no animal stops at that boundary. They know that that doesn't exist. So it's this acknowledgement of it. But people gather together. And at the most recent Canoe Journey, which ended up in Puyallup at the south end of the Sound, they stopped at Alki, or as it would have been said at the term, Alki. Alki is a newfangled term that if you talk to people from Seattle who've lived there forever, they sort of give you a dirty look. But they gather here, and it was incredible to see dozens upon dozens of these beautiful canoes paddling up on shore. And as they came on shore, there was a representative of the Puyallup tribe who said, "Welcome to our land. We hope you will share stories, you will share food, you will share our place." And as I was sitting there watching, and to see out into the Sound, these just canoe after canoe coming in, I can imagine what it must have been like back in the 1700s with these great gatherings of these great, just beautifully hewn watercraft coming in. It must have just been startling to see, as it was for me. And these are not light boats. This is a massive chunk of cedar. And that was again, everyone was gathering together. So the Canoe Journey has really revived within the cultures. When I talk to people from the tribes who were there, all of them express this newfound connection through the canoe to the place that they lived, as they better understood currents, as they better understood the tides, as they better understood the need to know the geography of their place. But all of this begins to change in 1836 with the arrival of the SS Beaver. The Beaver was built on the Thames in London in 1835. As you can see, it's sort of funny looking. It's a side wheeler. And what they did was when they built it in London, they then took the paddle wheeler off. They fitted it for sailing. They sailed it from London around South America to Hawaii, from Hawaii back to the mouth of the Columbia River to Fort Vancouver, which at the time was controlled by the British, the Hudson's Bay Company. They take off the sails, de-rig it, re-rig it as a paddle wheeler, and steam it up into Puget Sound. And for about the next 50 years, this was a very important vessel for moving goods up and down the Sound. And in essence, for the HBC, for the Hudson's Bay Company, in essence what it was a traveling general store, in the sense that it moved people, it moved goods up and down. And its name was, as I said, the Beaver, and it really lived up to its name. They could go about 12 to 14 hours, which is maybe 250 miles on paddle wheeling. They would then have to stop for a day or two to cut down enough wood to keep moving another 12 or 14 hours. So it wasn't what you call efficient. And fortunately, there was a lot of wood there, so it really wasn't that big a deal. You stop, you send your flunkies on shore, they cut everything, and then you keep moving. Eventually it gets converted to coal. But this was the classic, this was really the first of the steamer, no, it really was. It was the first steamer to arrive in the Puget Sound, and it opened up the opportunities. It showed people the potential for the importance of having a vessel like this, where you didn't have to rely on the wind. You didn't have to rely on your own power to move the vessel. You had steam to do this. And with this, there was just one problem with the Beaver, is that it was British. 1846, this area becomes part of the U.S. 1853, it becomes Washington Territory. And in 1853, we finally get our first steamer. It's called the Ferry. I know this is very hard to read, but it was a little tiny, they called it a packet, a little tiny steamship. In fact, it arrived on top of a sailing vessel that sailed into Puget Sound. They took it off. They built it as a little steamer. It was described, my favorite description is, it was undersized and cranky, which you probably could describe, well, we won't go there. But it would steam from Olympia at the south end of the Sound up to Steilacoom, which is roughly near Tacoma, or up to Seattle and Alki. And one of the things I love about this is that in 1853, what we think of as Seattle and what we now call Alki Point were considered to be two separate settlements. And it cost $10 to go from Olympia up to Seattle. And just to put that in perspective, an average wage in 1853 might be $2 or $3 a day. So 3 times your daily salary to sail or to go on a boat up to Seattle. So it didn't do that well. It didn't help, too, that 4 years later it blew up and sank. That's a whole nother issue. But what it does, again, is it shows the potential. And people realize, wow, this is the way to go, that we need to have these steamers come into Seattle. And what we start to see is this incredible array of vessels. And it's come down to time what we know it is as the Mosquito Fleet. And this is this collection, if you will, an armada of vessels that went up, down, across everywhere in Puget Sound. And they start to arrive in the 1840s and basically were the ship in the 1880s, 90s, early 1900s. And I just want to tell you a little bit about them. The term Mosquito Fleet, which has become associated with Puget Sound, really did not originate in Puget Sound. It originally was used in reference to the Revolutionary War. In the Hudson River Valley, they described a fleet of very fast, small boats, as you can imagine, skimming about like mosquitoes, as we know and love them. And so that term was used there. It's used in the early 1800s to describe battles with pirates in the Caribbean. It's used in the Civil War, but eventually becomes a term associated with Seattle or Puget Sound. What we don't have, though, is a real definition of a Mosquito Fleet vessel. I like to compare it sort of to Judge Potter Stewart's definition of pornography. You can't really define it, but you know it when you see it. And you knew a Mosquito Fleet vessel when you saw one. They often had, hard to point it, but here they often had these pointy ends, so they're often called pointy enders. They would be flat bottomed, so they could go anywhere, typically made of wood, typically steam-powered, typically propeller-driven, even though obviously there are many that are paddle wheelers, either on the side or on the back of the vessel. And they came in all shapes and sizes. The shortest that I came across was one called the Polkey, which was 19 feet long. The longest was one known as the Yosemite that was 283 feet. And the longer ones were very elegant ships. They had beautiful wood in them. They were a place where you'd really want to be, nice dining facilities. It was a very different world back then. And they originally were primarily a north-south means of travel. That was really going from Olympia up to up to Seattle, maybe up to Port Townsend. They went north-south. But over time, as Seattle and Tacoma become the most important cities in Puget Sound, it really starts to become, as you can see, this east-west travel that, dozens and dozens and dozens of routes. It's estimated that there were at least 800 vessels that made up the Mosquito Fleet over the 60, 70 years that it was really dominated Puget Sound. And what I find even more amazing is that there were somewhere on the order of 350 different named localities. And at the end of this, there'll be a quiz to see who can name the most up here, those of you who remember this. But those stops could be official stops where there was a timed, where it would rhyme, okay, every Tuesday it would arrive, or it could be a stop that was simply someone would flag it down, or you could row out in your dinghy and the Mosquito Fleet, the vessel, would stop and pick you up. And to me, what was great about it is it was this connective tissue. It was a way to knit together all of Puget Sound. And I really think of the vessels of that as, the way I sort of think of it is as it was their lifeline, meaning in a sense it was a combination of post office, bank, transit system, UPS, truck, general store, and of course, a great way to catch up on gossip. You can imagine as people sort of went up and down and they could trade gossip. But again, it was this way to unite where you could live anywhere on the waterway in Puget Sound, and you had access to the larger cities. You could ship goods, you could ship people, and the vessel would eventually arrive there. So it was really a central part of the Sound, and that, as I said, that connective layering, that connective tissue that wove together the entire city. But obviously, all good things must come to an end, and the end for this, of course, as you might imagine, would be the automobile, and you start to see a change. And so we start to see a lot of issues. I love this just sort of random, all the different things that happen to them. And then, of course, you know, fire, collision, sink, run aground, explosion. Apparently, only one of them was sunk by a crew. You know, maybe there might have been one or two more at the time. But they slowly, the vessels start to disappear from Puget Sound. But amazingly, we have 2 Mosquito Fleet vessels are still left. Probably the best known is the Virginia 5. This was built initially in 1922, and it served the Colvos Passage, which is on the west side of Vashon Island. And it probably would have suffered the same fate as many other Mosquito Fleet vessels, except for the fact that in 1968 it was purchased by a group of people who were passionate about steamships. They have refurbished it, and they have made it available to the public. So you can rent it out. They do a variety of educational programs. They go all up and down the Sound, and it's beautiful inside. How many of you have been on the Virginia 5? Yeah, it's a stunning, stunning vessel to be in. But my favorite of the Mosquito Fleet vessels is much lesser known, and that is the Carlisle 2. The Carlisle 2, again, pointy ender, wooden, flat bottom. What's slightly different is, as opposed to the Virginia 5, which is steam-powered, this is diesel-powered, but it was built in 1917, and it has basically been running the same route since 1922, from Bremerton across the Sinclair Inlet, that little body of waterway, south to the towns of Port Orchard and another town that starts with an A that escaped me, that no one's ever heard of except for the more famous city on the East Coast, but that's irrelevant. But what's great about it is you can ride it. It rides every day. It's now owned by the Kitsap County. It's their foot ferry. It goes back and forth, back and forth. It's $2. This beautiful wood vessel. And what I like about it is, to me, it sort of still exemplifies the story of Puget Sound, the story of Mosquito Fleet, in that the people who ride it, many of them, the days that I've ridden it, in the mornings and the evenings, have looked to be people who were working in the Bremerton shipyard. And they lived on the south side of the inlet, and instead of having to drive around, get stuck in traffic, they could just walk down to the vessel, the Mosquito Fleet dock, which is basically just, and on one of them, it's just a dock that just pokes out in the water and the boat pulls up and pulls away. But again, it connects people to a place, to a larger entity. It allows them to live where they want and yet still be connected to the bigger story, the bigger city, the bigger connection of this whole region. So for me, it's just a lovely place, a lovely idea that this still exists, that they've kept it running for all these years. So if you ever have a chance to go to ride it, it's just quite fun. It's 8-minute ride, so it's not too taxing. It comes right back, so you don't want to get stuck in Port Orchard, which is a nice town. But then, as I said, the automobile comes. and you start to see a change. And the change occurs in several ways. One is that some of the early Mosquito Fleet vessels start to get adapted to be able to have a car on board. And what they would do is they would put a little lift on it. You'd drive in, the lift would then lower you onto the boat, and you'd be taken off the same way you came back on. They eventually start to, in the early 1920s, start to build what we think of sort of as the classic design of the ferry. You drive in one end, you drive out the other end. But the earliest ferry that operated, and by ferry I mean it's regularly scheduled, designed to carry either people or vehicles. So in a sense, it's Mosquito Fleet-esque. It's just sort of the next generation of the Mosquito Fleet. And the earliest one was called the City of Seattle, this boat up here. And it started in 1888, and it ran between Seattle and West Seattle, which is where the fast ferry now goes. And this one was actually adapted to have horses and wagons, so you could get on and just ride across. Initially, it was 15 cents a ride, but another ferry opened up at the same time, and there was a fare war, and it eventually got down to 40 rides for just $1. And the other boat then burned down, mysteriously or otherwise. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to say anything. But what's incredible, so the City of Seattle starts work in 1888. It still exists. If you ever go to Sausalito, there's what's known as the Yellow Ferry. You can stay on it from an Airbnb. It's $400 a night, six rooms, or 6 people can stay. So the City of Seattle, our earliest ferry, is still in existence. It was never yellow, but it's become yellow over time. So you start to see this change as ferries come on. And one of the other aspects of change beyond the shape of the vessel is who owned the vessels. So initially with the Mosquito Fleet, it was generally individuals who owned the boats, because there was a small scale operation for them, and so you didn't need the big money for it. And I just want to read you my favorite description. I think it gives you an idea of what the early vessels would have been like in terms of private ownership. And this is written by the historian and novelist Archie Binns about a boat called the Old Settler. It ran between Shelton and Olympia, and he described it as a bastard creation, a common scow with a donkey engine which had been induced on board under false pretense and then persuaded to turn a pair of homemade paddle wheels. It ends up dying under the Seattle wharf, but its engine lived on as a printing press, powering a printing press. But after having, being able to induce engines on boats, you then needed to have money to build ferries. And with that, this is the beginning of the change as the system adapts from these private ownership, individual owners, to private, much larger owners. But I just want to stop and think about this time period, 1950, as Seattle and the region starts growing. And there was a proposal to connect the Seattle side, Seattle, Tacoma, to the west side. And they had three. Those of you who've lived in Seattle, you know that one of the things that Seattle is really good at is having these great visions of transportation. I'll just quit there. You all get it. So, what they proposed was to build a floating bridge, basically from West Seattle to Vashon Island, basically the modern route of the Vashon Island ferry. It would have been about 14,500 feet long, which is about twice as long as the I-90 bridge that goes across Lake Washington. But even under more audacious, they proposed 2 underwater tubes, that one connecting from over at West Alki across to Restoration Point, and one north from West Point across to the island here. And these would have been concrete tubes, 3 feet thick, and sunk about 50 feet below the surface, held by anchor wires, and you would drive on and go through this tunnel. And the longest one would have been something like on the order of 20,000 feet. So 3.5, almost 4 miles, 3 miles underwater, which I'm sure we all would have just felt great, Many of you, if you've not been to Seattle lately, you've probably suspect that they're not there. We, of course, never did that. No one has ever built anything like this in the world. But Seattle, great ideas. But we then get the development of the ferry system. And it becomes through what's known as the Blackball Line. And this is the line that eventually controls the entire ferry system in Puget Sound up until 1951. And this is the consolidation. And one of the things that I love about it is it's the only thing that I found that there was a sound. And so I want to just play a little snippet from a song. It's about 1.5 minutes long. You, of course, know who that is. And what's great is his grandfather, Bing Crosby's grandfather, ran a Mosquito Fleet vessel. So he had this deep connection. So I love that. I also just, the politics, and it's just such a fabulous song. So we start to get the change, and we have the development of the Blackball ownership. And Blackball was a classic entity, a classic monopoly, and some people loved it and some people hated it. And there was then debate for about 8 or 10 years in the legislature about what was going to happen, what would be its fate, and eventually the idea was that the state would take over, even though many people considered that to be creeping socialism, to have the state take over the WSDOT. But eventually, in July of 1851, the ferry system becomes owned by Washington State. And one of my goals in writing this chapter was to ride every ferry in Puget Sound. And I don't know if my wife's probably left the room, knowing her. She sneaks out on things like this. But I think it sort of exemplifies my sort of weird nature. So my goal was to ride them all. And most of us are familiar with the WSDOT ferries, the ones up here, this list of 10. There are 10 different routes that the WSDOT runs from the south end down at connecting Tacoma to the south end of Vashon Island, and then all the way up to the north end and the San Juans. But there are, as you can see, there are 12 other routes in Puget Sound. The Kitsap ferries, as I pointed out, the ones that go across right here. Here's our Carlisle. Oh, actually, this doesn't have the Carlisle too, but they're fast. One's a fast ferry that connects Bremerton to downtown Seattle. Pierce County has one that goes from Steilacoom to Anderson and Ketron Islands in the south end. You may be familiar with Ketron. Recently made it in the news when someone stole a plane and crash-landed it on the island. There is the Lummi Island ferry at the very north that connects up to Lummi, and this one was one of my favorites because when you ride the ferry, they don't connect your fare in line. They don't connect it till you're on the boat, and an attendant walks around in these sort of waves bouncing along and goes up to each car and each passenger and collects the fee. It was just really sort of a very nice system. There's one that goes across to Güemes Island, again, a small one. Don't ever ride it on a holiday weekend, or at least try and come back from the island. It's a little bit challenging, but it's, again, this is it. I'm at the back end of the ferry. There's maybe 20 cars at most on it. We were the last one on, so I can speak of having to wait in line for that. Then there's the King County ones. These are these fast ferries that zip along, one to Bremerton, one to Vashon, and then one into West Seattle. And then there are a series of private ferries. And again, my definition of a ferry, regularly scheduled with a published, regularly going with a published schedule. And these are from homeowners associations up there. And I, again, tried to write all of them. The Decatur Island one wouldn't even let me on the boat. The Gedney Hat Island one let me on the boat, but they wouldn't let me off the boat onto the island. And the Heron Island one let me on the boat, and they let me off the boat onto the island with, the, of course, understanding that I would leave soon. I caught the next one back. So there are these 3 private ones. And then the final one I rode was the one, Jetty Island, which is up in Everett, which goes just across the harbor in there that connects to an artificial island that's been made. It was a jetty, and over time it's filled in with sand. So there are 22, and there's actually a 23rd now. The Kitsap is now running a ferry from Kingston, a fast ferry from Kingston into downtown Seattle just started to operate. So that's one of my, I need to get that to be a completist. But I want to think about the ferries and what they mean to Seattle. And I was lucky enough in doing my rides to spend some time with one of the captains, a woman named Marcia Morse. And Marcia has worked with the ferry system for something like 40 years, every possible position, every route. And she's now a captain. We rode back and forth. And she made a couple observations. One is that how much the ferries have changed over time. And she thinks one of the things that we've lost somewhat is this connection to the ability to connect to the water right there. That's a little bit harder to get out onto the boats, outside onto the water level, and sort of feel that little bit more intimate nature. So she sort of was a little bothered by that. She thought the designs could be changed. But more importantly, she had this very spiritual view that struck me. And it started from this observation that she grew up in eastern Washington in a landscape where you had big views. You could see a long distance. And she said when she moved to western Washington, she was struck by the fact that, and again, you've probably all experienced this, if you go hike in our part of the world, western Washington, you don't often have big views. You're stuck in the woods, and not stuck. I mean, you're walking through this incredibly beautiful landscape, but you get to an alpine lake, you can see a little bit. You get into the woods, you can't see. But when you're out on a ferry, you have these big views. You have this sort of spiritual connection. And she liked to think, and she said it for herself, even though she's been doing this for 40 years, she still slowed down a bit. And it gave her time to contemplate, to think about, this vastness, this beauty of the landscape, and this sort of spiritual connection. And I think, to me, that's one of the strongest aspects of the ferry system that we have, is it gives us this opportunity to stay connected to the place of Puget Sound, to that landscape, to see the big stories, to see, we can see incredible wildlife. If you've been on there, people see whales all the time, and you see seals, and that, for me, is what I was trying to do as a writer. As Nicole said at the beginning, I'm trying to think about connections, trying to think about relationships, think about the incredible beauty of Puget Sound. Those of us who live up there, it's remarkable landscape, and we have some problems with it, but we also have made this change in philosophy, and this is a big part of what I sort of, if I sum up the whole book in some sense, is that we understand better the nature of this place. We understand its beauty, its fragility. And although we may not be able to fix it, we will never return it to what the landscape was pre-contact. But we have this understanding of the importance, and I think we are all, those of us who live in Puget Sound and have connections, recognize that there's something magical about Puget Sound. And it's getting out in it. We are incredibly fortunate that we have an opportunity through the ferry system, through walking, or whatever it is, to encounter what is arguably one of the most beautiful, beautiful spots there is. And I feel fortunate to be able to write and share some of those stories. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out on this gorgeous day to sit in the dark for a few minutes. Thank you. It would be my pleasure to make up answers to questions you might have, and I hopefully can see you, and don't be shy. I know people have questions. Yes, in the orange.
I have a question. A long time ago, I was informed that one time there was a plan to dig a canal, much like they have in the Northeast, from Willapa Bay up through Hood's Canal, connecting it with a waterway further north. It was to prevent having to go off the coast, and it was a barge canal that would accept pleasure boats as well. And I'm a pleasure boater, so I was kind of interested.
Right.
So it would take you from the Columbia River down to the channel, into Willapa Bay, up into another place, cut across Hood's Canal. You'd have to dig a channel.
Right.
Of maybe 5-6 miles was all, and that would connect you with the lower region there of Lake Washington.
Right.
Somewhere in there.
Okay, I can comment about that, and I'll repeat the question. The idea that there was a proposal to connect basically from you could come in the Columbia River, and then there would be a connection that would connect you up to Willapa Bay, and then also a connection in the south end of Hood Canal that would bridge that little gap there that would bring you across to the sort of southern part of Puget Sound. There was a proposal for it, and again, like several of the other proposals, well, like many proposals, it never went anywhere. It was talked about in the state legislature, but nothing was ever done beyond just this idea. And it would have been, at least particularly the Columbia River one coming north, that would have just been a huge, huge project. And you always sort of wonder why they never did connect the south end of Hood Canal across to the main body of Puget Sound. And some would argue it's a good thing they never did, and some people would argue, well, we should have, because instead of having to make that sail all the way around. But there were proposals, nothing ever happened. Yes?
Question about the use of the area. Is there any limitations in terms of congestion or long-term plans about it being overutilized?
Right. Any long-term plans about overutilization? You see stuff come up, and I looked less at that because I'm more looking at the history. I'm just sort of starting to dive into the chapter that looks about some of the future part of it. There always seem to be plans. I mean, probably the big one, there's a big shoreline management plan. So there are talks about it, but I'm not informed enough to make an educated discussion of it. But if you want, I'll talk about it for 30 minutes and blabber on. But no, I'm sorry, I don't really know. Yeah. Oh, good question. So how has the ferry system affected the islands and the people who live on it, and how has it affected sea life? The islands, I think, the islands have certainly grown and continue to grow as more and more people can get out to there. So without them, the bigger islands, would never have developed. But I think where you sort of see it, how important the ferries are, how essential they are right now where we have several ferries down, and it's just sort of panic. And in the 1940s, there was actually I think a 2-week-long period where they shut down the entire ferry system because the Blackball, which owned it, was in this battle, and people basically panicked. They tried to do everything they can. So it's essential, and really continues to be that essential connective tissue. And it's interesting to watch if you ever ride the ferries in the morning, particularly Bainbridge, and it's filled with hundreds and hundreds of commuters. Not a single one of them, maybe 2 or 3, are actually looking out the window or paying attention to what's around them. They're all, which makes sense. You do it every single day. If we drove every day and we didn't have to drive, if we could do that, we would do the same thing. But it's sort of fascinating that even though they have this connection, and Captain Morse makes the point that people do slow down. It's sort of probably a battle there. In terms of sea life, it's one of the issues. They're trying to understand what sort of sound is produced by the ferries in relationship to the orca. Is that affecting the orca in the sound? But what's nice is they're actually doing some science with the ferries where they're tracking the currents through there. So it's probably has some, but not much. Because if you think about it, they go pretty regularly, but relative to the sound, they're not that they're not that common in the sense that there's only a handful of it, and ones, particularly compared with what it must have been like with the Mosquito Fleet, where there could have just been hundreds crisscrossing back and forth. So, yes, sir. I don't, I think it was, why did the Port Angeles ferry get to remain a blackball? I think they were just looking for consolidation within the Sound, and that was considered an outlier. That's my recollection from when I was doing research. But it's a good guess. That's still the Blackball ferry line, and you can maybe still hear Bing sing, so which would be great. Yes, way in the back there. Do the Washington State ferries run in a deficit, or are they neutral? British ferry or the British Columbia ferry is more expensive. I don't know the answer to that. I've seen the numbers, but I don't remember what the answer is on that. I think they're okay, but I really don't know. I know that it requires lots of subsidization. And if you look at the fees for the ferries, if you compare them back to what they were historically, they're fairly similar. If you took what it cost to run it in the 50s and then just extrapolated with inflation, they're actually about the same price. So, but I don't know if that really answers. I don't know the answer for sure. I'm sorry. Right, I can imagine that more of an experience. Ours are definitely, and if you look at it, the ferries are really part of the highway system, and all the maps go that way. And I sort of think of when you wait in line for a ferry, you're basically just in a traffic jam, which happens every once in a while in Seattle. This just happens to be a different type of traffic jam. We like to give people new experiences. So, yes. Uh-huh.
I have to tell you, it was like a religious experience because those locks are so stunning, absolutely stunning. I'd always thought it would be nice to go to see the Panama Canal.
Right.
I don't care about the Panama Canal anymore because I saw this amazing canal. Who was
Hiram M. Chittenden. Right.
It's beautiful, and it gives you such a sense of the beauty of the water and how somebody there in that area decided to just guide that water.
Right. So the lock store, those of you couldn't hear, hadn't been to Seattle until a handful of years ago. Like many of us, fell in love with the locks and sort of what is the story, who is Hiram M. Chittenden. So the lock story, I will do the very abbreviated. Actually, the idea of connecting saltwater and freshwater starts in 1854 when Thomas Mercer of Mercer Street says that there should be, that we should call the lake that he was living on Lake Union in the hopes that someday it will unite Lake Washington and the saltwater of Puget Sound. July 4th, 1917, the locks officially opened. 63 years between idea and completion. Again, just pointing out that transportation issue right there. 63 years for a project to be completed. Hiram N. Chittenden was in the 1909, was head of the Army Corps of Engineers office in Seattle. And what Chittenden does is several-fold. One is he unites the people behind the idea of building the canal. This has been going back and forth for many years. He's also the one who comes up with the basic design of the locks in the sense that it would be just one set of locks in one location as opposed to in two locations. Because you have to connect Lake Washington, which was historically 29 feet above sea level, Lake Union, 20 feet above sea level, and Salmon Bay, a freshwater tidal inlet. How do you make those all the same level? Chittenden comes up, or basically convinces everyone of the idea is that you flood Salmon Bay, raise it to be 20 feet above sea level, leave Lake Union at 20 feet, and lower Lake Washington by 9 feet. So Lake Washington was originally 9 feet higher. And so the third thing Chittenden does, and one could argue this is the most important, he got federal funding for it. and he's the one who gets the money. He has nothing, interestingly, he has nothing to do with the building of the locks. There was another engineer had taken over the office by the time who ran the project to make sure that it actually got built. There's many unique aspects, and one of the unique aspects of two unique aspects of the locks, or interesting aspects. One is it's the only locks of its kind in the country that you can actually cross the lock mechanism. If you think about you walk across there, you can't do that any other place. And two, next time you're there, if you stand on the locks and you look out to the west, you cannot see Puget Sound at that point. They moved the locks back just far enough to the east so you couldn't, so that if an enemy vessel was coming down Puget Sound, the locks would be outside the vision of enemy bombardment. So that's why they're at that exact location, just back a little bit, so that they would not be blown up. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. The locks are it's an amazing structure and a gift that we have. And there's really no other place in the country that has anything like it, this connection between salt and freshwater through this lock system. And they were built at the time of the Panama Canal, so the doors and the mechanisms are exactly the same, just on a little bit smaller scale. I think the tallest doors at the Panama were 90 feet, or are 90 feet, and the tallest ones at the locks are, I think, 55 or 60 feet deep. Yeah. What about earthquake issue in Puget Sound, or with the locks specifically, or just everywhere? Oh, we're pretty. I mean, we live in an area where we are highly susceptible to earthquake. Seattle is eventually going to be destroyed by an earthquake. I'm bearer of bad news, but we've got 3 major fault zones. But in terms of its effect on the sort of bigger structures, very limited. That worry. The biggest concern people have would be some sort of tsunami coming in the strait. And we do have evidence, they don't know exactly when, but we have evidence at the very upper end of Hood Canal. So if you think of Hood Canal making that big U, at the very upper end there's evidence, tsunami deposits from an earthquake, that they don't have any evidence for it occurring in the Sound, that it must have come, a tsunami must have come in to Puget Sound, up in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, took a right turn at the Admiralty Inlet, and then taken a right turn again and come down Hood Canal and come up. So we do have, tsunamis have hit, and we had one about 1,100 years ago from what's known as the Seattle Fault that runs under Seattle. But we're probably pretty good. I would put that lower on our concerns from a tsunami point of view than just earthquake damage destroying many, many things in that area. Yes? Wow. And if those of you didn't hear, if you had taken the Virginia fee from Lake Union to Vashon for campfire camps. Wow. Sister did. Okay, so some of you did. Excellent. Yes.
How did they cut these up? Is this all just fire?
How are the cedar logs, how are the cedar canoes made? From what I've heard, I think mostly, I don't know how they got sort of the heart of it out. They may have done some burning, but we have, the evidence we have are for a variety of adzes to cut it out. But what excavated the sort of bigger part, I don't know. It would have been stone, and then eventually, obviously, once Europeans arrived, they start to get metal. But they would have had some sort of harder stone to do that.
Funny, I was just looking at my pictures from 2014 of the locks. It never ceases to fascinate me, even though I'm not there. Isn't there a place, people were worried about the salmon or the fish?
Right.
They actually built
Yeah.
sections so that the fish had a...
Right, so when they originally built the locks, there was a sea ladder, and it was a state requirement to build the fish ladder for salmon to get through. It was completely useless because they didn't understand how fish moved, and most of the fish that went through locked through. They would just go into the locks, and when the locks raced through, they would continue. They rebuilt them a handful of years ago, 25, 30 years ago, and they are in much better. They work much better, but still, it depends on the species, and it depends on the sex of the fish, whether they go through by the lock or whether they go through by the ladder. The big problem, as I heard someone saying, is there used to be animals that would hang out. Herschel, the sea lion, is probably the best known, that would hang out when the water came out, and basically, was the best smorgasbord ever invented for sea lions. They would transport him, and then he would swim all the way back up, and they finally dealt with the issue. So, yes. Yes, I've heard it called that, Mount Tacoma, yeah, and Mount Rainier. So the same thing. They've been battling for decades. Tacoma always wants it to be called Tacoma. The original native term was something along that line, Tacoma, which basically meant snowy mountain. Whether it referred specifically to that one, or it probably depends on who you talk to, whose snowy mountain it was. But that was the original. And there's been discussions over this for years about this. So why don't I take one or two more questions and then let you all go. Yeah, sir. A great question. Has there been any effect of the Bremerton shipyard on marine? I've not come across any. My guess is they have, but I have not actually investigated that issue. So, one final question. So before I thank you, I think there are a few books in back. The gang, there's copies of Waterway, which is photos having to deal with the ship canal that I did with my friend Jennifer Ott. Too High and Too Steep, Reshaping Seattle's Topography, that looks at the big engineering projects. The front cover is that classic image of what's come through time as the Spite Mounds, showing the lowering of Denny Hill. And then the Seattle Walks book, these 17 walks. So again, thank you kindly. I will be back. Seeing my wife is signing that I will be outside to sign the book. So it was my pleasure.